The Brisbane Courier, on the 15th of April 1887, carried the following report from the correspondent who had gone to great lengths to find out what had happened in the latest maritime disaster. Quote, "Today I disembarked at Pauillac from the Pacific Steam Navigation Company's steamship Patagonia, which had on board most of the survivors of the ill-fated immigrant ship Kapunda. I joined the vessel at Lisbon, and during the passage hither conversed with the survivors with the object of eliciting the details of a disaster which had hitherto been described only in the barest outline."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? Kapunda doesn't take the usual course.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Kapunda had left London on the 12th of December, 1886, and, after a short stop in London, had continued on her voyage to Fremantle, Western Australia, on the 18th. She was a good ship with a good reputation, having been built specifically for the immigrant trade in 1875 for the firm Trinder, Anderson and Company of London. The 1,135-ton iron-hulled sailing vessel still had an A1 rating, and was under the command of one of the best captains that Trinder, Anderson and Company employed. Unusually for the time, the exact number of people on board was well recorded, because many of them were nominated immigrants or selected by the West Australian Land Company or by Crown agents. On board, the Kapunda, which had very limited cabin accommodations, had only 4 cabin passengers, a schoolmaster traveling with his wife and 2 children who were intending to settle in Western Australia. There were also 17 paying steerage passengers. The majority of the people on board were the 188 nominated immigrants, followed by 34 laborers nominated by the land company to build a railway in exchange for plots of land, and 29 domestic servants who had been chosen by the Crown. As these were all people planning to start a new life across the sea, there were many large families included in their number. In addition to the passengers, the Kapunda had a crew of 40 on board, traveling under the command of Captain John Masson. In total, there were 314 people on board the Kapunda as she set sail. This was not the first voyage the Kapunda had made carrying immigrants to Australia, and she was noted to be in complete compliance with the Passenger Act under the Board of Trade. Indeed, she exceeded the requirements of the Act. She carried a crew larger than what was required, and also had more boats and flotation devices than were required at the time, though they were not enough for everyone on board her. She had enough space in her 6 boats for 163 adults, which, even though it was not enough space for the 314 people on board, was still more than what was required by law. She also had 18 lifebelts and 6 lifebuoys. If there was a fault, it lay in the law and not with the owners of the Kapunda. The Kapunda had also not been overloaded as many ships, to the point that it was noteworthy to the newspapers. On board, she had 600 tons of cargo and 300 tons of ballast, and she was described as being somewhat high in the water as she left Plymouth. The Kapunda, in good condition and without a heavy load, made good time in her voyage and crossed the equator on the 9th of January, 1887. Normally, the Kapunda would have plotted a course close to the Brazilian coast to take advantage of currents there, but since the wind was so favorable, they were able to travel further from the coast of Brazil than normal, something that they would later regret. It was 3:20 in the morning on the 20th of January, when the lookout gave the alarm that another ship was approaching. The other ship proved to be the British-owned Ada Melmore, another iron-hulled sailing vessel. The 10-year-old Ada Melmore was about half the size of the Kapunda at 591 tons, and, unlike the Kapunda, was intended for cargo rather than passengers. For this voyage, the Ada Melmore was carrying 843 tons of manganese ore from Coquimbo to Queenstown. On board, she had a crew of 14, under the command of Captain Milliken. By all rights, the Ada Melmore had the duty to avoid the Kapunda, since the Ada Melmore had the wind of the starboard side, and the Kapunda had the wind blowing on her port, but the two ships found themselves in a collision course instead. That was not for lack of trying to avoid it. First Mate Cottrell, the officer on watch of the Kapunda, turned the helm hard and turned to the left of his course, which would have brought the Kapunda across the bow of the Ada Melmore, and the Ada Melmore should have passed astern of the Kapunda. First Mate Cottrell probably would have changed the course of the Kapunda even more quickly, except that it was dark, and while the Kapunda was showing lights, the Ada Melmore had none. It was not until Ada Melmore was very close to them that the lookout had seen her and shouted his alarm. That the two ships should have passed close together but missed one another is what would have occurred had the mate on watch of the Ada Melmore, Nelson Waddell, not also turned hard at the same time. In the Ada Melmore's case, it was to the right of her course, the exact opposite of the direction the ship should have turned in order to avoid a potential collision. The Ada Melmore was thrown directly into the bow of the Kapunda on the starboard side. Right before the collision, seeing it was inevitable, First Mate Cottrell made a run for the forward deckhouse in the hopes that he would be able to head off any panic amongst the passengers. The crew of the Kapunda was one that followed the rules and regulations put forward by the British government strictly. Among these rules was one that stated that the cabin for the single women on immigrant ships must be kept locked at night to prevent after-hours mingling in the dark and to keep order. As soon as the ship was struck, it was clear to everyone on board that the ship was in sinking condition, and the crew, still keeping order, began to get lifeboats ready. Unfortunately for everyone on board, there was no time to do so. It was estimated that at most only 5 minutes, and most likely in as little as 2 minutes after the collision, the Kapunda sank, carrying all but one of the lifeboats down with it. The forepart of the Kapunda broke off entirely, allowing the water to rush in unchecked. With all of the single women still locked in the women's cabin with no chance of escape. With how quickly the Kapunda sank, no one had time to find where the matron of the ship had put the key and let them out, though their shouts could still be heard. It was not known how many of the married women and children reached the deck, since they had all been asleep below due to the collision happening so early in the morning. What is known is that none of the women and children could be counted among the survivors. Indeed, very few people at all would be able to escape from the sinking Kapunda. Right after the collision occurred, 50 or 60 people made it to the deck, but many of them were struck by falling spars. First Mate Cottrell, having seen the exchange of the damage, turned back to find Captain Mason and report what had occurred, and that there was no hope of saving the ship. The last time he had seen the captain was standing on the poop deck, but he never had the time to make his report. He had just reached the poop when the masts gave way and came crashing down, smashing open the decks and hatches and trapping people beneath them. With this final blow, the Kapunda listed to starboard and sank. First Mate Cottrell was carried down with the ship at first, but managed to swim up again, only to be tangled up in the mizzen rigging and forced to fight with it for his freedom before he could reach the surface. Apprentice seaman Norman had also been sucked down with the sinking of the ship. His station in case of such an accident was in a gig, and by the time he reached it, the boat's crew was all there already waiting for him. As the ship tilted precariously, though, it became impossible to launch the boat and they all climbed onto the deck again. Norman had only just reached the deck of the ship again when it sank beneath his feet. He estimated that 6 times he rose to the surface, only to be struck with debris, forcing him below the water again. When he finally found unobstructed water to surface in, he found 2 men clinging to a hen coop, and he joined them. The hen coop kept rolling as the 2 other men kept pulling on it, and so as soon as Norman saw an upturned lifeboat, he swam for that instead. He had a hard swim. The debris that had struck him before had injured him badly, and he said that his right arm was almost entirely useless, so it took him time to reach the boat. Behind him also came the 2 men who had been clinging to the hen coop, who, apparently, also liked their chances better on the upturned boat. Once they reached the boat, they found a sailor named Hughes already laying on it, and they joined him. Hughes, who seems to have believed for a time that he was the only survivor, was relieved to see them and welcomed them on the boat. Eventually, 2 other sailors and 1 of the passengers would also join them in laying over the keel of the boat, with all 6 of them spending the night yelling for the bark that struck them, and meeting with no response. Through the night, they did hear the occasional scream, and it was reported later by other survivors that sharks had dragged down some of the people who had survived the initial sinking. With the light of dawn, the people on the upturned boat could see the Ada Melmore, about 5 miles distant, but it obviously did not see them. Since an upturned boat did not offer any options for navigation, they decided their next order was to right their boat. This was an attempt that took 2 hours of effort, while they drifted further and further from the bark. It was only when they were able to see nothing more than the royal yards of the Ada Melmore that they finally managed to right the boat. The boat was a proper lifeboat with watertight chambers, which was lucky since it had lost its stem and stern, and its bottom had holes in it. It was clear that it had fared no better than they had with the sinking of the Kapunda. Still, it was able to keep afloat, and due to the diligence of the crew of the Kapunda, there were still oars, a mast, sails, and life jackets tightly lashed in the boat. The 6 men first put on life jackets, and then got the mast up, and they headed toward the Ada Melmore. It would take them another 2 hours to reach the bark, but when they were seen, they were immediately pulled up. Norman, with his severe injuries, was immediately brought into the cabin, where he was cared for by Captain Milliken and First Mate Cottrell, who had been found by one of the Ada Melmore's boats, where he was almost unconscious and only afloat due to having tied himself to a stanchion and brought on board. Among the crew of the boat was one of the Kapunda sailors. He was one of the 9 men, 2 members of the crew, and 7 of the passengers who, at the time of impact with the Ada Melmore, had thought to leap onto the other ship and climb on board her. Unfortunately, 2 members of the Ada Melmore had done the same in reverse and had gone down with the Kapunda. In total, 16 men would congregate on the deck of the Ada Melmore. 8 passengers and 8 members of the crew, the only survivors of the over 300 people who had been on board of the Kapunda. In a matter of minutes, 303 people had been lost. The Ada Melmore did not offer much safety, though. Though it was still afloat, it, too, was badly damaged. The only reason it was not in immediate danger was because it had a watertight bulkhead which was strained but did not break. As the ship continued its voyage, Captain Milliken ordered that the ship be ready to evacuate at a moment's notice. To help their chances, Captain Milliken ordered that part of her cargo of manganese ore be thrown overboard, but he still also ordered that the Ada Melmore begin to fly distress signals. Their distress signals were responded to on the 25th of January by a French bark named the Ulysses, which took on board 14 of the survivors from the Kapunda since Captain Milliken was still willing to try to save his ship. The departure of the survivors was a relief for him, since if his ship did go down, he would now have enough space on his lifeboats to save everyone. 2 of the survivors from the Kapunda, the ship's carpenter and one of the sailors, decided to remain on board of the Ada Melmore. Instead, the Ulysses also took a portion of the Ada Melmore's crew that did not want to run the risk of the ship sinking beneath their feet. Captain Farin of the Ulysses initially only agreed to take them to Rio de Janeiro, but by the evening, after picking them up, he seems to have developed a strong sense of sympathy for them and agreed to take them to Salvador, Brazil instead, where it would be easier for them to get home. All of the survivors of the Kapunda quickly healed, with the exception of Norman, who, it was worried, would not survive due to how serious his injuries were. Captain Farin took special care of the young sailor, however, allowing him to share his cabin so he would be comfortable, and taking turns with First Mate Cottrell to nurse him. But Norman did not seem to recover. On the 29th of January, they came to the coast, where a Brazilian man-of-war had them heave to. It would be another 2 days of anxiety until they would be allowed into the harbor, because they had come from Coquimbo, where there had been a cholera epidemic. For those on board of the Ada Melmore, who were all anxious to get Norman to a doctor, it was a difficult wait. But when they were finally allowed in, they found that the local British consul had already done a fundraiser for their benefit. In addition, an English chaplain named Reverend Alfred Butler opened his doors to the first mate and Norman so that they could fully recover, and invited the other survivors to his house for dinner with him and his wife. The men were so touched that one of the sailors from the Ada Melmore pulled out a jeweled box from Japan and presented it to their hosts as a sign of their gratitude. Several days later, the group of men would be on their way back home. The men who remained on the Ada Melmore were eventually rescued by the steamship Orator. The Ada Melmore had only remained afloat until 8 days after the collision with the Kapunda, and then had sunk as well. What welcomed the crew of the Ada Melmore on their return to England was a flurry of public attention, and to be called in front of the Wreck Commissioner's Court. To the amazement of almost everyone, Mate Wannell, who had been on watch on the Ada Melmore, did not have his certificate taken away by the court. In an act that was considered unusually merciful, court stated that they did not wish to be too severe in their punishment for what was a lapse in judgment in a time of danger. Considering the terrible loss that had accompanied his lapse in judgment, many people felt this was generous indeed. Captain Milliken would not be so fortunate for his decision to not keep any lights lit on his ship. He told the court that he generally kept them lit when he was in a normal shipping channel, but they had not been at the time. This much was true, as admitted by First Mate Cottrell. The Kapunda had indeed departed from the normal shipping channel, but their course had not been a dangerous one. Captain Milliken also said he would light the lanterns in poor weather or when he saw another ship, but they had not seen the Kapunda, and the weather had been fine. It was not an excuse that pleased the court, and they suspended his certificate for 2 years. It was pointed out in Captain Milliken's defense that he was following a common practice because captains who saved the owners of the ships in the cost of lantern oil were well liked and rewarded for the practice. It was said that once ships were 3 days out from London, almost all of the cargo vessels ceased showing lights for this reason, and it would not be until the owners were penalized in some way for this and held accountable would the practice be changed. For those who had been on the Kapunda, the practice of not showing light had proven much more costly than using lantern oil.
For more information, please see the Southland Times from April 19, 1887, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.